So you spent the whole semester trying to understand public policy, and in this module, we're going to try to put it all together. In doing so, we'll review some of what you've learned this semester concerning public policy, what are the themes that govern U.S. policy making, but then we'll push it a bit further, and we'll try to understand this idea of policy capacity of the government and how we can improve it, and further, how we can improve citizen capacity in the policymaking process. We started the semester off by considering the policy process model, or the way in which policies are made in the United States. At the first step of this process, we have to figure out what the problem is. Remember, formal and informal actors can bring the issue or the problem to the table. Ultimately, it has to get put up on the agenda for something to be done about it. But remember, the most salient or most important and the least controversial problems are most likely to make their way onto the agenda and actually be addressed by the governing institutions and policymakers. Once we've figured out what the problem is and it's made its way to the agenda, next we have to figure out how to solve that problem. We develop policy alternatives. This is the policy formulation stage. This is where most policymakers just want to jump right into and figure out how to solve the problem. Once you've got your solution in hand, you have to legitimate, essentially, the problem. The policy has to work its way through the governing body and be voted on and ultimately pass through. It has to be seen as legitimate. Only then can the policy move forward into the bureaucracy and be implemented. Remember, illegitimate policies have a very difficult time in terms of being implemented, as they'll face a lot of hurdles, both social and political. Finally, you have to evaluate the policy. Did it work? Did it do what it needed to do? And then determine, do you need to make a change? This is why the whole policy process model is cyclical. It's a wheel. It's no start and no end. We're constantly updating policies to change and adapt to problems in society. After we finished the policy process model, we dove then into policy analysis. And what was the goal of policy analysis? To make better policy. As such, which steps of this process do you remember were best influenced by policy analysis? Take a second and think through the steps of the policy process model. Remember, the steps that are best impacted by policy analysis are problem definition and agenda setting, policy formulation, and policy evaluation and change. However, it could be argued that by using policy analysis, policy legitimation could be easier, as well as policy implementation. We then thought about policy making and policy analysis across a variety of policy areas. And we really did cover the gambit of everything the U.S. government does, from economic and healthcare, welfare to education, environmental, and finally foreign policy. But remember, there were connections across these policy areas too. They don't exist in a vacuum. Throughout the course of these policy areas, as well as trying to understand policy analysis, we considered all the various instruments that the government has at its disposal to enact policy. Take a second and read through this list. Come up with an example for each of these different policy instruments. So what are regulations? Remember, this is licensing, inspection, enforcement of standards, application of sanctions. These are the things we most commonly think of the government doing. An example could be something like a workplace safety regulation. What then is taxing and spending? Taxing is taxing an activity at a level that encourages or discourages certain behavior, whereas spending is spending money on a preferred program. A specific example of a tax would be something like putting a sin tax on, or putting a tax on cigarettes to discourage smoking. For spending, this is pretty easy. It's anything the government spends money on, like public higher education. What are subsidies? They're loans, direct payments or benefits, tax credits, price supports. A good example, again, would be student loans. Remember, you are potentially being subsidized by the government to increase your education and become a productive worker in the workplace and society. What's a market mechanism or a market incentive? Well, this is a special category of taxation or an imposition of fees that creates incentives to change behavior and achieve goals and objectives. Think about the Toyota Prius or other hybrid vehicles. The government could offer a tax rebate for purchasing a hybrid vehicle. What is education? Well, it's providing information to the public through formal programs or other actions. This could be something like formal public meetings or even something as simple as a food safety label. Finally, consider those unique foreign policy tools, things like diplomacy, the foreign relations, foreign aid, giving money or economic or military means to other countries, and defense, military spending. Finally, we considered a litany of evaluative criteria to help us understand if a policy is good or if it has certain limitations. We first considered the big 3 E's: effectiveness, efficiency, equity. But we also considered things like liberty and a variety of feasibility options: social, political, administrative, and technical. Over the course of the various policy areas, we considered these evaluative criteria and the certain trade-offs we have to make when we pursue one versus the other. Ultimately, of all these evaluative criteria, which are the most important ones? Well, remember, for the government, the first 2 are the most important: effectiveness. Is it meeting its goal? Is the policy doing its job? And further, in this political environment, efficiency is important too. Is it meeting its goal, but at the lowest cost possible? Yet for other members of society, equity and liberty tend to be the ones that reign supreme. But for most policymakers, feasibility is also very important and can be a non-starter for a policy. If the public doesn't accept the policy initially, or could hurt your re-election chances for pursuing it, well, the policy's dead on arrival. Same thing for political. If you don't have enough support to even move it through the halls of Congress or a state legislature, it's not going to go anywhere. And finally, administrative and technical. If you don't have the skills, the technology, the means to actually implement the policy, well, you're going to have some significant problems, and you don't want to spend your political capital actually pursuing that policy. So then, put it all together. What do policy analysts actually do? Why do they engage in policy analysis? Well, any policy maker, be it a member of Congress, a state legislator, a city council person, can make a policy. But is it going to be a good policy? Will it actually address the problem? Will we spend a ton of money actually trying to put it in place and have it not actually do the job? Policy analysis, remember, gives us better solutions. It helps us to make better policy. Ultimately, we have to study the problem, come up with a variety of alternatives, then analyze those alternatives, considering the pros and cons for each, ultimately selecting one policy above them all, and then further evaluating it once we put it in place. Remember, policymakers often forget to do this.